Welcome to an exploration of something your brain is doing right now, in this very moment, that classical physics says should be impossible. As you process these words, listen to these sounds, and form thoughts about what you're hearing and reading. Tiny structures inside your neurons are vibrating at frequencies so specific, so precise, that they might be performing quantum computations that shouldn't exist in the warm, wet environment of your skull. Yet they do. Some studies published in peer-reviewed journals suggest this possibility. This is not a story about spirituality or mysticism cloaked in scientific language, though such interpretations exist. This is an investigation into genuine frontier science, into the possibility that consciousness itself might operate through quantum frequencies that mainstream neuroscience has largely overlooked or even dismissed. For decades, mainstream neuroscience has assumed that the brain works like a classical computer, billions of neurons firing in patterns, creating consciousness through pure information processing. But what if there's something else happening beneath that classical layer? What if consciousness has a quantum signature? And what if understanding those frequencies could unlock some of the deepest mysteries about what it means to be aware, to think, to feel, to be conscious? Tonight, we're diving into that possibility, not as certainty, but as inquiry, as a respectful exploration of what the latest experimental evidence is suggesting about the nature of your mind. If you've ever wondered whether there's more to consciousness than we typically acknowledge, whether the subjective richness of your inner life might be connected to something deeper than synaptic firing, then this is where that question leads us. Let's begin by asking a question that seems simple, but turns out to be profound. What if the actual seat of consciousness isn't the neurons themselves, but something far smaller, far stranger, oscillating at frequencies we've only recently learned to measure? There are frequencies happening inside your brain right now that exist in a realm of physics that most people never hear about. When we talk about brain waves, we usually mean the electrical rhythms that electroencephalography machines detect. Slow delta waves during sleep, rolling across your cortex at 1 to 4 cycles per second. Theta waves during meditation at 5 to 7 Hz. Alpha waves in relaxed wakefulness, around 8 to 13 cycles per second. Beta waves during focused concentration, and gamma waves, the fastest at 30 to 100 Hz, associated with high-level cognitive processing. These are real and measurable, but here's what's remarkable. These brain waves, these classical frequency patterns that we've known about for decades, might be the surface expression of something far more sophisticated happening at a much smaller scale. Below the level of neurons, inside the structures that give neurons their shape and integrity, something is oscillating. Something is vibrating at frequencies measured in megahertz, in billions of cycles per second. The difference between brain waves at 30 Hz and these quantum oscillations at millions of hertz is like comparing the sound of a clock ticking to the color of light itself. These aren't metaphorical vibrations or poetic descriptions of neural activity. These are actual quantum frequencies that researchers have now directly observed in laboratory conditions, measured with sophisticated optical instruments, and validated through peer-reviewed studies. The discovery has profound implications because it suggests that consciousness doesn't simply emerge from the classical electrochemistry of neurons firing, like coins dropping through slots in a machine. Instead, some researchers propose that consciousness may involve quantum computations occurring at scales and frequencies our current classical models have only begun to explore. The neurons would then function as the visible interface, the output layer, with the real computational action happening at a much smaller scale within microtubular structures inside those neurons. Imagine for a moment standing in a concert hall where you hear a beautiful symphony, a complex orchestral work. The music you perceive, the integrated experience of melody and harmony and rhythm, emerges from hundreds of individual instruments playing simultaneously, each vibrating at specific frequencies. Violins at different pitches creating the soaring melody lines, cellos resonating at lower frequencies, providing harmonic depth and grounding, woodwinds adding texture and tonal color, percussion providing rhythm and punctuation. Yet the subjective experience of the symphony is unified, coherent, transcending the individual instrumental notes and parts. You don't hear the violin section first, processing that separate from the cellos, then the flutes arriving later and being somehow mentally stitched together. You hear them woven together seamlessly, integrated into a single aesthetic experience that feels unified and whole. This is analogous to a fundamental puzzle in consciousness research. Your consciousness might work similarly to that orchestra. Below the threshold of your awareness, millions of quantum oscillations might be happening in structures called microtubules, distributed throughout your brain in every neuron. These quantum frequencies are orchestrated, coordinated, aligned across entire networks of neurons through physical connections and potentially through quantum entanglement. And their interference patterns, their resonance, ANSIs, their harmonic relationships, might be what actually generates the unified field of awareness you experience as consciousness. The moment-to-moment coherence of your subjective experience, the seamless integration of sight and sound, and bodily sensation and complex thought might emerge from quantum coherence, binding information together across distributed neural tissue in ways that classical neural networks operating independently alone cannot explain. Each neuron firing is like an individual instrument, but the conscious moment is like hearing the symphony. This isn't happening by accident. If this interpretation is correct, then your brain appears to be exquisitely fine-tuned to capture and amplify these quantum frequencies, to protect them, to use them. The architecture of your neurons, the precise arrangement of proteins within your microtubules, the geometric lattice of tubulin dimers, the way these structures connect to one another across your entire cortex through gap junctions and possibly through quantum entanglement. All of this seems optimized for maintaining coherence at quantum scales in an environment where such coherence shouldn't theoretically survive. Most quantum systems we've studied in laboratories require near absolute zero temperatures to maintain their quantum properties without rapid decoherence. They live for mere fractions of a second, often femtoseconds or picoseconds, before environmental interference, before thermal noise and background radiation destroys their coherence and collapses them into classical states. The brain does this at body temperature, around 37 degrees Celsius, warm as your hand in sunlight. It does this in a warm, wet, electrically noisy environment filled with constant molecular motion and electromagnetic activity. It does this continuously, every moment of your waking life, and arguably during sleep as well, every second you're alive. That this is possible at all was considered impossible just 30 years ago, an impossibility grounded in what we understood about decoherence and environmental interaction. Scientists thought the brain was simply too chaotic, too hot, too soaked in water, and filled with too much noise to maintain any genuine quantum effects for meaningful durations. Some researchers now argue that nature may have found ways to support such effects despite these conditions. When neuroscientists talk about the classical brain, they're describing the well-known story of neural transmission, a story that's been refined and elaborated over more than a century of research. Information flows from neuron to neuron through synaptic connections. A neuron fires, generating an electrical impulse that travels along its axon. Neurotransmitters are released from vesicles at the axon terminal, cross the microscopic synaptic gap, bind to receptors on the receiving neuron, and trigger an electrical cascade. This cascade propagates along the receiving cell's membrane, generating changes in electrical potential. If the input is strong enough, the cell reaches threshold and fires itself, generating an action potential that travels down its own axon. The signal travels onward, neuron to neuron, in this sequential fashion. From this perspective, Consciousness is the emergent property of massively parallel classical computation happening across your neural networks. Your brain is a biological computer running on the substrate of electrochemical gradients, and consciousness is what it feels like to run this particular software, what it feels like to execute this particular algorithm at this particular scale. This model has dominated neuroscience for decades, and it has considerable real explanatory power. We can map neural correlates of consciousness with functional imaging. We can see which brain regions activate during different conscious experiences, which brain states correlate with different qualities of awareness. We can even induce or suppress specific conscious states by stimulating or inhibiting certain neural circuits with electromagnetic fields or optogenetic techniques. The classical model explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. And when you probe the gaps, some remarkable possibilities emerge. There's a persistent gap, a mystery that classical neuroscience has struggled with for centuries. Philosophers have known about it for even longer. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. The question isn't how information is processed in the brain. That's the easy problem, relatively speaking, and it's not actually easy. But classical neuroscience has made progress on it. We understand how neurons fire, how synapses work, how networks of neurons process information. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is this: why does any of it feel like anything from the inside? Why do you have subjective experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be you? You could theoretically have all the same neural activity, all the same classical computations, all the same behavioral outputs without any conscious experience whatsoever. You could be a philosophical zombie, a system that acts conscious, that responds to stimuli appropriately, that processes information and makes decisions, but contains no inner light, no subjective awareness. Nobody would be home inside. There would be behavior without experience. The fact that you're not such a zombie, the fact that there is something it's like to be you, that consciousness has this qualitative felt dimension, remains unexplained by classical neuroscience alone. No amount of mapping neural firing patterns or describing computational flows explains the existence of subjective experience. This explanatory gap is where some researchers introduce quantum consciousness as a potential framework rather than a proven mechanism. When you measure brainwaves using EEG technology, what you're actually detecting is the cumulative electrical activity of millions of neurons firing in rough synchrony. An electrode placed on your scalp records the combined electrical activity from roughly 1 million neurons in the underlying cortex. The slow oscillations you see on an EEG display, theta rhythms around 5 to 7 cycles per second, delta waves at 1 to 4 cycles per second, these oscillations emerge from something. They're not generated randomly. They have structure, pattern, temporal organization. Beneath these classical frequencies occurring at scales 1 billion times higher, quantum processes might be orchestrating the classical rhythms we observe. This is what the Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory proposes, a framework developed by mathematical physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, beginning in the early 1990s. The theory proposes that microtubules within neurons maintain quantum coherence at physiological temperatures. That this quantum coherence generates what are called OR moments, discrete instances of unified conscious experience occurring roughly 40 times per second. According to this theoretical model, these OR moments could generate the phenomenal conscious moment you experience, and that the interference patterns of these quantum collapses, the resonances and harmonics of orchestrated quantum vibrations across your brain, produce the classical brain waves we measure with EEG technology. In other words, the classical brain waves you might see on an EEG readout are the echo of quantum reality, the macroscopic shadow cast by microscopic quantum vibrations. The neurons are like a speaker vibrating, and the brain waves are like the sound waves it produces. But the real music, the source of the pattern, is the quantum oscillation inside the speaker. In this interpretation, the real computation may be happening at deeper quantum scales. This is profoundly different from the conventional neuroscience story. It's not that consciousness emerges from the brain waves. Rather, the brain waves are what we see when we measure the surface effects of deeper quantum processes. Think of it this way. You go to the beach at night and see bioluminescent waves crashing on the shore. The light is beautiful, clearly real, measurable, with sensitive instruments. But the source of that light isn't in the wave itself. The light emerges from billions of tiny organisms contained within the water, each producing photons at specific wavelengths, billions of organisms creating an integrated pattern of illumination that creates the visual effect you see. Similarly, your classical brainwaves, the patterns your EEG detects, might be the visible expression of billions of quantum oscillations happening in microtubular structures throughout your brain. Some interpretations suggest that the real computational mechanisms underlying consciousness could exist at deeper quantum levels beyond what classical models currently explain. The real action, the real computation, is happening at a scale we're only now beginning to measure and understand. The story of discovering quantum frequencies in biological systems is relatively recent, spanning perhaps the last 15 to 20 years of intensive research, and it began with a puzzle that shouldn't have been puzzling once you think about it carefully. Photosynthesis. Plants and photosynthetic bacteria convert light energy into biochemical energy with extraordinary efficiency, around 95 to 97% efficiency by sophisticated measurements. This is remarkable because it approaches the theoretical quantum limits of efficiency predicted by physics, the maximum possible efficiency any system could achieve. How could evolution achieve this level of efficiency? The conventional explanation suggested that classical processes, ordinary chemical reactions without quantum effects, should only achieve around 70 to 80% efficiency, leaving a persistent 10 to 25% unaccounted for. Where did the extra efficiency come from? When researchers began investigating carefully, using spectroscopic techniques and quantum theoretical modeling, they discovered the answer was quantum tunneling and quantum coherence. Photosynthetic systems don't actually route energy by classical diffusion. Instead, photosynthetic complexes maintain quantum superposition, allowing energy to explore multiple possible pathways through the photosynthetic machinery simultaneously, like water testing every possible path through a maze at once, then selecting the most efficient route. This happens in the warm, wet cytoplasm of living plant cells, in conditions that conventional quantum theory said were impossible for quantum coherence. This discovery was controversial when first proposed, but the evidence accumulated through multiple independent studies and replications. Then came navigation. Birds migrate thousands of miles using accurate magnetic field detection. And when researchers examined the proteins in bird eyes, respi, responsible for this extraordinary navigational ability, they found evidence of quantum entanglement. Particles in these proteins, specifically in light-sensitive molecules in specialized bird retinal cells, existed in correlated quantum states that allowed detection of subtle magnetic field gradients far beyond what classical physics would permit. Again, this was happening in warm, wet biological conditions in living animal brains. Then olfaction, your sense of smell, your ability to distinguish and detect thousands of distinct odors and combinations of odors, appears to involve quantum tunneling in olfactory receptor proteins. Electrons tunnel through molecular barriers in ways that classical molecular mechanics cannot explain, allowing sensitivity to molecular structures that classical chemical recognition shouldn't permit. This mounting evidence of quantum biology creating functional advantages for living organisms created a conceptual opening, a paradigm shift. If nature had evolved mechanisms to harness quantum effects in photosynthesis, in bird navigation, in olfaction, then why not in the brain? Why not in the very neural structures that gave rise to consciousness itself? Some theorists then proposed that this possibility could extend to consciousness, not as proven fact, but as an investigable scientific hypothesis. This logical question led researchers back to something neuroscientist Stuart Hameroff had been studying carefully for decades: microtubules. These structures, found in virtually every cell, but particularly abundant in neurons where they form the cytoskeleton, had long been considered merely passive cytoskeletal scaffolding, structural supports giving cells their shape and rigidity. They gave cells their form, helped transport materials along their length, provided structural support, resisting mechanical stress. But Hameroff and others suspected they might do something far more interesting, something more functionally important than structural support. Inside these hollow cylindrical tubes, made of precisely arranged protein subunits, called tubulin, might be the perfect biological environment for quantum coherence. The tubulin proteins contain electron-rich regions, hydrophobic pockets, precisely arranged geometric lattices that could potentially support quantum processes, protect them from environmental decoherence, allow them to persist. In the mid-1990s, Hameroff partnered with renowned mathematical physicist Roger Penrose to develop a comprehensive theory that would eventually become known as orchestrated objective reduction. They proposed that quantum computations happening in microtubules, orchestrated and coordinated across the brain's entire neural networks through various connecting mechanisms, could give rise to consciousness. This remains a theoretical framework rather than established consensus. The timing of these quantum computations, they calculated using Penrose's theory of objective reduction, would produce discrete conscious moments roughly 40 times per second, a prediction perfectly aligned with experimental measurements of conscious perception timing from decades of cognitive science research. The theory was radical. It challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness. It was rejected by many mainstream neuroscientists, but crucially, it made specific, testable predictions. And those predictions could be tested using experimental methods. Microtubules are not mysterious biological structures. They're well studied, well understood, from a classical perspective. What's mysterious is the possibility that they could potentially harbour quantum processes at the core of consciousness. To understand why they might, you need to know what they actually are structurally, how they're organised, what their physical properties are. Imagine a cylinder made of protein. Not a solid cylinder, but a hollow tube composed of thousands of smaller protein molecules arranged in a precise three-dimensional lattice, like a molecular fence surrounding an empty space. These protein molecules are dimers of tubulin, specifically alpha and beta tubulin subunits, that pair together. They fit together with exquisite precision, forming the walls of the microtubule in a highly ordered geometric pattern. But inside this geometric structure is something remarkable from a quantum perspective. The tubulin proteins contain hydrophobic regions, areas that repel water and create isolated pockets within the E-protein structure. Within these pockets, electrons can become delocalized, spreading across regions of the protein rather than being bound tightly to specific atoms. This delocalization means the electrons exist in a state of quantum superposition in multiple locations simultaneously, following quantum probability distributions rather than classical trajectories. Additionally, tubulin contains tryptophan molecules, amino acids with electron-rich indole rings, spaced approximately 2 nanometers apart throughout its structure. This spacing, this precise arrangement, creates an environment where quantum effects could theoretically propagate and persist, where quantum coherence could extend across multiple tubulin molecules organized in the microtubular lattice. The structure of the microtubule, in other words, appears almost specifically designed to support quantum coherence. When physicists and neuroscientists studied this structure carefully, when they began running detailed quantum mechanical calculations about whether quantum states could maintain coherence within microtubules at body temperature, something unexpected emerged. The answer was yes. Not easily, not without specific architectural features, but yes. The geometric arrangement, the presence of electron-rich regions, the natural isolation from environmental decoherence provided by the protein structure, all combine to create what amounts to a biological quantum computer. And this quantum computer is located in every neuron in your brain, potentially thousands of them, millions across your entire brain, all up, iterating simultaneously, all coordinating their quantum states through gap junctions and potentially through quantum entanglement. If consciousness were to emerge from quantum processes in microtubules, then this would imply a form of quantum processing power within the brain. Each neuron with potentially thousands of microtubules, each microtubule capable of maintaining quantum coherence for biologically relevant timescales and performing quantum computations. Billions of neurons network together through synaptic connections, through gap junctions that directly connect neighboring neurons, and potentially through quantum entanglement that connects microtubules across distances that would seem to violate classical physics, the computational substrate for consciousness under this interpretation. Computation is not classical, it's quantum, and quantum computation is fundamentally different from classical computation in ways that might be essential to consciousness itself. A classical computer operates on bits, zeros and ones. At any given moment, each bit is definitively in one state or the other, no middle ground, no ambiguity. A quantum computer operates on qubits, which can exist in superposition, in all possible states simultaneously until measurement collapses them into definite values. A quantum computer can explore exponentially more possibilities, exponentially more potential solutions, exponentially more potential conscious states than a classical computer of the same physical size. This exponential power is why quantum consciousness, if supported by future evidence, might explain aspects of consciousness that pure classical models struggle with. The richness and subtlety of subjective experience, the apparent unity of consciousness despite arising from billions of separately firing neurons, the creative flexibility of human thought and imagination, all of these might be reflections of underlying quantum computation accessing vast solution spaces. The binding problem, the long-standing neuroscientific mystery of how disparate sensory information from different brain regions is integrated into unified experience, may find possible explanatory models in quantum entanglement mechanisms. Quantum information isn't localized to single locations. It's distributed, correlated, instantaneously interconnected across distances. If consciousness involves quantum processing in microtubules distributed throughout your brain, then binding all that information into a unified conscious moment becomes straightforward, theoretically. It's not a mystery requiring new classical mechanisms or explaining away as mere illusion. In this theoretical context, it's what quantum systems naturally tend to do. The biggest objection to quantum consciousness, the wall that stopped many scientists from taking it seriously, comes down to a simple phrase: warm, wet, and noisy. This phrase, first popularized by physicist Chris Koch and others in the neuroscience community, encapsulates the fundamental problem that quantum consciousness faced as a theoretical proposition. Classical quantum systems require isolation, extreme cold, protection from environmental interference. A quantum computer in a laboratory operates at temperatures close to absolute zero, sometimes colder than outer space, around 1/10 of a degree above absolute zero, or even lower. At these frigid temperatures, atoms move slowly, vibrations are minimized, thermal noise is suppressed to nearly nothing. The quantum states are maintained in carefully controlled vacuum chambers, isolated from vibrations and electromagnetic radiation, shielded from any stray environmental interactions. The brain, by contrast, operates at 37 degrees Celsius, warm as a summer day. It's soaked in water, a medium that conducts heat and creates thermal motion. It's filled with ions and proteins and metabolites, creating an electrically noisy environment. There are constant chemical reactions happening, constant molecular motion, constant heat dissipation. The prevailing assumption for decades was that quantum coherence couldn't survive in such conditions. If you tried to maintain a quantum computer in a warm, wet environment, quantum physicists said it would immediately decohere. The quantum superposition would collapse into classical states within fractions of a picosecond, faster than you could blink, faster than you could think. The quantum information would be lost to thermal noise. The theory seemed airtight. It was a reasonable assumption based on our best understanding of quantum physics and decoherence. However, later findings in quantum biology suggested that this assumption might be incomplete. What changed was evidence from quantum biology, from organisms themselves. When researchers began finding quantum effects in photosynthesis, in the light-harvesting complexes of plants, they had to reconcile these findings with the theoretical prohibition against warm, wet quantum effects. Photosynthesis happened in the warm, wet cytoplasm of living plant cells. Bird navigation used quantum effects in proteins exposed to body temperature. The olfactory system of mammals seemed to employ quantum tunneling at physiological temperatures. These findings from nature forced a theoretical reconsideration. The reconciliation came gradually. First, through detailed computational modeling of how quantum systems could be protected within biological structures, how the architecture of proteins and lipid membranes could potentially insulate quantum information from environmental decoherence. Then, through direct experimental observation, researchers at universities including Alberta, Princeton, and Central Florida, funded by organizations like the Templeton World Charity Foundation's Consciousness Research Program, began conducting careful experiments. They shined light into microtubules and measured how long the quantum signal persisted. They used sophisticated optical techniques to track quantum coherence in tubulin proteins. The results astonished many in the scientific community. Quantum coherence lasted far longer than classical physics predicted. In some cases, optical excitations propagated through microtubules for hundreds of milliseconds to seconds, orders of magnitude longer than the femtosecond timescales Tegmark's 2000 decoherence calculations had suggested. The quantum state didn't collapse, it persisted, it propagated, it seemed to be maintained by the structure of the microtubule itself, protected by the geometric arrangement of proteins, by hydrophobic regions that isolated quantum information. The warm, wet environment of the cell didn't destroy quantum coherence. In some cases, research suggests it may even help to preserve it through mechanisms still being investigated. Evolution, over billions of years, had discovered how to build biological systems that maintained quantum effects despite conditions that would destroy artificial quantum computers. This discovery, this fundamental paradigm shift in what was theoretically possible in warm biological systems, opened the floodgates for serious investigation into quantum consciousness. If nature could maintain quantum coherence in photosynthetic systems with near-perfect efficiency in navigation proteins, then maintaining it in microtubules was not only possible, it was plausible. The apparent impossibility dissolved. What remained was evidence. What remained was the question of whether that quantum coherence in microtubules actually generated consciousness. The skepticism persisted, but it became skepticism about mechanism and causality rather than skepticism about basic feasibility. The skeptics asked legitimate questions. Okay, so quantum coherence can persist in microtubules, but does it actually matter for neural function? Does it actually influence neural firing? Can quantum processes in these tiny structures really scale up to produce conscious experience? Are they epiphenomenal, merely along for the ride, or are they causally relevant? These are profound questions, and answering them required new experimental approaches, direct observation of whether disrupting microtubular quantum coherence actually affects TS consciousness itself. This is where some researchers turn to anesthesia as a test environment. What began as an investigation into how anesthetics work became interpreted by certain researchers as potential evidence supporting the possibility that quantum consciousness might be real. In the early years of the 21st century, physicists and neuroscientists faced a genuine dilemma, a tension that threatened to derail the entire quantum consciousness research program before it had truly begun. The theoretical predictions suggested quantum coherence shouldn't persist in the brain. Yet the growing evidence from quantum biology suggested it did. Something had to give. Either the theory was incomplete or the experiments were misinterpreted. The resolution came not from philosophical debate, but from direct measurement, from clever experimental design that could actually observe quantum frequencies in microtubular tissue. And what researchers discovered when they finally looked directly, when they built the instruments sensitive enough to detect these oscillations, was nothing short of remarkable from their perspective of interpretation. The challenge of measuring quantum coherence in microtubules at body temperature is immense, almost insurmountable when you first think about it. You can't simply stick a probe into living tissue without disrupting what you're trying to measure. Any invasive measurement device generates heat, introduces noise, potentially destroys the very quantum coherence you're attempting to observe. It's like trying to measure the position of an electron without affecting it, like trying to observe a dream without waking the dreamer. You're caught in a paradox. To know that the quantum system exists, you have to observe it. But the act of observation destroys what you're trying to observe. This is called the measurement problem, and it's been central to quantum physics for a century. But there's an elegant solution that physicists have developed over decades of quantum experimentation, a technique as fundamental to quantum science as the telescope was to astronomy. A method that seems to transcend this paradox. Light. Specifically, laser light at precisely controlled wavelengths, directed through biological tissue in ways that allow quantum states to reveal themselves through fluorescence measurements. It's non-invasive, it doesn't require cutting into tissue, it allows you to listen to what the quantum system is doing from the outside. When you shine ultraviolet or visible light into biological tissue, when you excite electrons within proteins to higher energy states, those electrons exist in this excited state for a brief moment. Then they cascade back down to lower energy states by emitting photons, by emitting light. This emission process happens incredibly quickly, but the timing of this emission, the wavelength of the light emitted, the pattern of decay over time, all contain information about the quantum state of the electrons, about how they were behaving before they collapsed. This is fluorescence lifetime spectroscopy. It's like putting a quantum stethoscope up to biological tissue and listening to its heartbeat, listening to its frequency signature. In the hands of researchers like Greg Scholes at Princeton and Jack Tuszynski at the University of Alberta, it became a window into the quantum nature of microtubules. It became a tool for actually observing the frequencies we'd only theorized about before, only calculated mathematically. This technique allowed researchers to explore whether aspects of quantum behavior could be present in biological structures. Imagine shining a laser beam, ultraviolet light, at a specific wavelength, directly into a sample of microtubules extracted from neurons. The light excites electrons within the tubulin proteins. These electrons exist in a superposition of quantum states. They're oscillating between different energy levels, tunneling through molecular barriers, exploring multiple quantum pathways simultaneously. Then they collapse. They cascade down to lower energy states, and in doing so, they emit light. They emit photons that you can detect with sensitive instruments. Now here's where the quantum part becomes visible. If those electrons were behaving classically, If quantum effects weren't present, the light would be emitted very quickly, almost instantaneously, within picoseconds, or at most nanoseconds. The classical prediction was femtoseconds, mere trillionths of a second. But that's not what the researchers observed. When Tarzinski's team shined ultraviolet light into microtubules, when they measured the fluorescence lifetimes, when they tracked how long the quantum excitations persisted before collapsing, they found coherence lasting for nanoseconds. 5 nanoseconds. That's thousands of times longer than classical physics predicted. 5 nanoseconds might not sound like much in everyday terms, but think about it in context. A nanosecond is 1/billionth of a second. 5 nanoseconds is 5/billionths of a second. Yet that duration, that impossibly brief interval by human perception, is an absolute eternity in the quantum realm. In theoretical discussions, this is considered long enough for potential quantum computations to occur. It's biologically relevant. It's considered potentially consciousness relevant within the frameworks that explore quantum models of mind. At Princeton, Greg Scholes and Arat Kalra conducted complementary experiments using tryptophan fluorescence lifetimes, techniques that had previously been used to study photosynthetic complexes. They studied the specific quantum properties of tryptophan molecules within tubulin, the electron-rich indole rings that are distributed throughout the protein structure. These tryptophans, these electron-rich pockets, are arranged throughout the tubulin molecule with remarkable precision, spaced approximately 2 nanometers apart throughout the three-dimensional structure. 2 nanometers is essentially the quantum scale where effects begin to emerge. This spacing isn't accidental. It may have been optimized through natural evolutionary constraints to facilitate quantum coherence propagation. The tubulin protein appears almost engineered for quantum processing. When Scholes and Kalra excited tryptophan fluorescence in microtubules, when they measured how long the quantum states persisted, they found something equally striking. Laser-induced optical excitations propagated far further through microtubules than expected. They didn't degrade rapidly, they persisted. The quantum information carried by these excitations didn't collapse into classical noise. Instead, it propagated through the crystalline lattice of tubulin protein dimers, traveling distances that suggested genuine quantum coherence, not classical energy transfer. The signal didn't weaken, it carried information across the protein structure. At the University of Central Florida, Aristide Dogariu's team conducted perhaps the most elegant experiment of all. They shined visible light into one end of a microtubule sample and measured how long it took for that light to be re-emitted from the other end. In classical systems, you'd expect rapid attenuation. The light would be absorbed, scattered, lost in the warm, wet, noisy, biological environment. But that's not what happened. The microtubules showed re-emission of light persisting for hundreds of milliseconds, even up to seconds. Let that sink in. Seconds. From a quantum system in a warm biological environment at body temperature. The implications were staggering. These observations suggested organized quantum patterns persisting in biological tissue far longer than expected. Something about the structure of microtubules, something about how evolution had arranged these protein lattices, was protecting and facilitating quantum coherence. The geometry was right. The chemistry was right. The architecture was optimized for quantum information processing. And yet measurements alone don't prove consciousness. They demonstrate quantum effects. They show that microtubules can maintain coherent states, but they don't directly show that these states generate consciousness. That connection required a different experimental approach, a different kind of evidence. That's where the anesthesia studies entered the picture with extraordinary power. Think about what anesthesia actually does. When you go under general anesthesia, consciousness vanishes, not gradually, suddenly. One moment you're aware, talking to the anesthesiologist, forming thoughts and memories. perhaps slightly anxious about the upcoming procedure. Then the anesthetic agent is administered. The mask is placed over your face, or the drug enters your bloodstream, and within seconds, consciousness collapses completely. You have no experience of the time passing, no sense of duration, no continuity. Your last conscious thought simply ends, and your next conscious moment occurs hours later in recovery. It's the most complete, most reliable way to eliminate consciousness that medicine possesses. The mechanism has always been mysterious. Anesthetics are chemically diverse. They have different molecular structures, different chemical properties. Ether is organic. Propofol is organic. Nitrous oxide is inorganic. Xenon is an inert gas. What do they have in common? How do all these chemically distinct compounds produce the same effect? For decades, the leading theory suggested anesthetics worked by disrupting the physical properties of cell membranes, by altering the fluidity of lipid bilayers that surround neurons. The theory proposed that anesthetics physically blocked neural communication by changing membrane properties. This theory made intuitive sense but had a persistent problem. The concentrations of anesthetics required to significantly alter membrane fluidity, as measured in laboratory experiments, were higher than the concentrations that actually induced unconsciousness. There was a gap, an inconsistency. Something else was happening, something more specific, something more fundamental to the nature of consciousness itself. In 2024, research from Wellesley College offered a radical answer. Professor Mike Wiest and a team of undergraduate researchers designed an experiment to test whether anesthetics work specifically by disrupting microtubules. The logic was elegant. If consciousness depends on quantum coherence in microtubules, then anything that disrupts that coherence should disrupt consciousness. They worked with rats, measuring the precise timing of loss of consciousness under anesthesia. They used isoflurane, a common inhaled general anesthetic used in clinical medicine. The same anesthetic you might receive if you underwent surgery. The same compound that has been used safely for decades. The experimental design was straightforward but clever. One group of rats received the anesthetic alone. Another group of rats received the anesthetic along with a drug that specifically binds to microtubules and stabilizes their structure, preventing the normal dynamic assembly and disassembly of these structures. The stabilizing drug protects microtubules from collapsing, maintains their architecture. If anesthetics work by disrupting microtubular quantum coherence, then stabilizing microtubules should delay the onset of unconsciousness. The quantum coherence would be preserved, and consciousness should persist longer. If anesthetics work through other mechanisms unrelated to microtubules, if they work by disrupting membranes or by blocking neural firing or through some other classical mechanism, then the stabilizing drug should have no effect. The anesthetic would still produce unconsciousness at the normal rate. The results were unambiguous. The rats that received microtubule stabilizing drugs took significantly longer to lose consciousness. They maintained their righting reflex, their ability to restore normal posture after being placed on their backs, for substantially longer than the control group. The anesthetic was present. It was entering their brains. The drug was circulating through their blood. But the microtubule stabilizing drugs delayed unconsciousness, delayed the onset of insensitivity to stimuli, delayed the collapse of consciousness. This suggested a potential causal link specifically involving quantum processes in microtubules, not disruption of membranes or other more general cellular mechanisms. This finding was published in the peer-reviewed journal eNeuro in August 2024 and has been interpreted by many researchers as significant preliminary evidence supporting this theoretical model. For those working in quantum consciousness research, it was considered a watershed moment. Philosophical debate within those circles shifted heavily toward this interpretation rather than being universally concluded. Consider what this implies. If consciousness depends on maintaining quantum coherence in microtubules, then disrupting this coherence should eliminate consciousness. According to this interpretation, anesthetics somehow interfere with quantum processes in microtubules, preventing the orchestrated oscillations from maintaining their coherence. The orchestrated objective reduction moments cannot form. The conscious experience collapses. And when you stabilize microtubules, when you protect their quantum coherence with drugs that maintain their structure and prevent decoherence, consciousness persists despite the presence of anesthetic agents. The causality proposed here is theoretical rather than definitively established. The quantum frequency underlying consciousness can be disrupted, and when it is, consciousness ends. As you listen to this, as you consider what this means for your own consciousness right now, in this present moment, consider that one interpretation suggests your awareness persists because your microtubules maintain their quantum coherence. Right now, in billions of neurons throughout your brain, quantum oscillations are happening. Frequencies are oscillating in a coordinated, orchestrated way. Coherence is being maintained despite the warm, wet, noisy environment that should theoretically destroy it. Every second of your conscious experience, every moment of awareness, every thought you're having right now depends on these frequencies continuing to oscillate, continuing to maintain coherence, continuing to bind information into unified conscious moments. Without this coherence within this theoretical framework, your subjective experience would vanish instantly. It would be like turning off the lights in a theatre. The entire show would go dark. Your consciousness would disappear, just as it does when anesthetics override the system, just as it does when anesthesia stops the quantum frequencies from being maintained. From this quantum-based interpretive perspective, this is what consciousness depends on. It represents one model of what you're made of from the quantum perspective. Now, when researchers talk about frequency signatures of consciousness, when they dig into what consciousness actually is at the level of physics and oscillation, they're not talking about a single frequency. They're not saying consciousness is a 40 Hz phenomenon, or a megahertz phenomenon, or exclusively anything. They're talking about a symphony of frequencies, a complex harmonic relationship between oscillations at multiple scales simultaneously, all working together, all coordinated. This is crucial to understand because many people think about consciousness too simply. They think of it as one thing happening at one frequency, but it's not that simple. Consciousness isn't a monochromatic phenomenon. It's not a single color of light. It's polyphonic. It's symphonic. It's not a single note. It's a chord, an agreement between multiple frequencies working together in harmonic relationship, creating something greater than any individual frequency could create alone. There's the extremely high frequency quantum vibration happening in megahertz ranges within the microtubules themselves, the fundamental quantum oscillations of tubulin electrons, the vibration of electron clouds in hydrophobic pockets. There's the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states occurring roughly 40 times per second, creating discrete conscious moments, discrete units of awareness, individual frames in the film of consciousness. And there's the integration of these moments through the emergence of classical brainwaves that we measure on electroencephalography, brainwaves that your doctors might show you on a readout if you underwent a sleep study or had a brain scan. When you see a gamma rhythm on an EEG readout, you're seeing a 30 to 100 Hz oscillation, electrical activity rippling across your brain at these frequencies, waves of synchronized neural firing. What you might not realize, what most neuroscience textbooks don't emphasize clearly enough, is that you're seeing the visible expression of underlying quantum frequencies averaging down through interference and resonance patterns. The microtubular vibrations in the megahertz range, happening in millions of neurons simultaneously, interfere with each other, creating beat frequencies at lower scales through harmonic resonance. These beat frequencies cascade upward into the classical frequencies we can measure with scalp electrodes. the frequencies that show up on EEG machines. The conscio, usness you experience, the subjective reality of your awareness in this moment, is described in some interpretations as the unified coherence of all these frequencies aligned together, orchestrated into a single, coherent pattern from the deepest quantum levels all the way up to the macroscopic brainwaves. According to the orchestrated objective reduction theory, consciousness doesn't emerge continuously. It emerges in discrete moments, what researchers call OR moments, occurring roughly 40 times per second. That's roughly one conscious moment every 25 milliseconds. Between these moments, between these discrete collapses of quantum superposition, your consciousness momentarily ceases. It's like a cinematic experience, like a film made of still frames projected rapidly enough that your perception integrates them into apparent continuity. Except it's not a film. It's reality selecting which possibilities become actual through quantum collapse. Each collapse represents a conscious moment, a discrete experience, a now. Quantum selection happening 40 times per second, and these 40 discrete moments per second, strung together through the continuity of memory and the binding of information through quantum entanglement, creates the flowing stream of consciousness you experience as continuous awareness. Your consciousness, moment by moment within this theoretical framework, is treated as a quantum event. 40 quantum events per second. The number 40 isn't arbitrary. It's not a coincidence that this frequency repeatedly appears in consciousness research. Gamma oscillations at around 40 Hz, what researchers call the 40 Hz phenomenon, have been repeatedly observed correlating with unified conscious experience, when different aspects of sensory information must be bound together, when you must experience red and round and smooth simultaneously as a unified perception of an apple, gamma oscillations increase. Multiple brain regions that process these different aspects synchronize at 40 Hz. The binding happens at this frequency. Why specifically 40? Some interpretations suggest the answer seems rooted in the balance between processing speed and coherence maintenance. Faster oscillations, more frequent collapses, would allow more information processing per second, but they would also require more energy, more precise orchestration across vast neural networks spanning the entire cerebral cortex. You would need more microtubules, more neurons, more quantum resources synchronized perfectly. Slower oscillations would be easier to coordinate. They would require less quantum coherence, but they would process less information per second. They would bind fewer aspects of experience into each unified conscious moment. The quality of consciousness would be diminished, less rich, less integrated. 40 Hz is proposed in this model as the sweet spot, the optimal frequency that evolution discovered through millions of years of neurological development. At this frequency, quantum coherence can be maintained across the necessary neural networks despite the warm, wet, noisy environment. Discrete conscious moments can be generated at a biologically useful rate, and the binding of information into unified experience can occur with sufficient scope and richness to generate what we recognize as conscious awareness. Different types of conscious experience might involve different frequency ratios and harmonics. The specific frequency signature changes. It's like an instrument tuning itself to different keys for different pieces of music. When you're in deep meditation, when your consciousness becomes quieter, more focused inward, the frequency patterns in your brain change noticeably, measurably, in ways that neuroscience has documented for decades. The dominant oscillations shift to lower frequencies. Theta and alpha rhythms become more pronounced. Rolling rhythms at 5 to 13 Hz, slow waves of oscillation washing across the cortex. This corresponds to altered states of consciousness, to different qualities of awareness, to consciousness that has a different binding pattern, a different integration of experience. The binding becomes more global, connecting distant brain regions into a unified, coherent state. When you're intensely focused, concentrating on a complex task, solving a difficult problem, understanding something intellectually, understanding these very words, gamma oscillations increase dramatically. The frequency signature shifts higher. The binding becomes more intense, more concentrated, more precise. In this interpretation, higher frequency moments contain greater information content, more detailed conscious experience. When you're dreaming during REM sleep, when consciousness becomes creative and associative, when it becomes freed from logical constraints, yet another pattern emerges entirely. The frequency relationship between different brain regions changes fundamentally. The synchronization loosens, the binding becomes looser, more associative, more fluid. The rigid binding that creates the logical consistency of waking consciousness, that keeps things organized and orderly, gives way to a more fluid binding that creates the dream logic of surreal dream consciousness, where things transform and blend and logic doesn't apply. Different conscious states are literally different frequency signatures. Your consciousness, metaphorically speaking, is tuning its frequencies in response to the demands of the situation, as interpreted through this quantum frequency framework, to what your brain needs to accomplish in that moment. This is why anesthetics work so reliably, so universally, despite their chemical diversity. They don't simply suppress neural firing in a crude way. They may selectively interfere with the frequency coordination between microtubules across different neurons. They break the orchestration. They interfere with the coherence maintenance mechanism. The quantum coherence can't be maintained at the 40 Hz frequency that consciousness is proposed to require in this theoretical framework. The coherence fragments into incoherence. The binding mechanism fails. The orchestrated objective reduction moments cannot occur. And without these moments, without the discrete quantum collapses that generate consciousness, there is no conscious moment. There is no awareness. There is no experience. There is only the continued biological firing of neurons without any experiential content, without any lights on inside, without any sense of being. This mechanism is suggested to potentially help explain why anesthesia is so effective at producing unconsciousness without necessarily stopping all neural activity. The brain doesn't have to shut down completely. It doesn't have to stop functioning. The heart still beats, the blood still circulates, the lungs still breathe, neural firing can continue at lower levels, reflexes can persist, the body's autonomic systems continue functioning, maintaining life support, but consciousness, dependent on the specific frequency coordination of quantum oscillations in microtubules, dependent on the maintenance of 40 Hz coherent binding across neural networks, is gone completely. You become a body without awareness, a system running without experience. But here's what makes the story even more fascinating, even more complex, and in some ways even more humbling. The frequencies we've been measuring, the 40 Hz binding frequency, the megahertz oscillations we can detect with fluorescent spectroscopy, these aren't necessarily the only frequencies involved. They might not even be the most important ones. There are scales of frequency we haven't yet learned to measure directly, according to ongoing theoretical explorations, not because they don't exist, but because the instruments haven't been built. The technology hasn't reached that level of sensitivity and specificity. And at these unmeasured frequencies, extraordinary things might be happening in your brain right now as you listen to these words. Unknown oscillations, unmapped frequencies, quantum processes operating at scales we haven't yet developed the capability to observe. Terahertz radiation exists in the gap between microwave frequencies and infrared light. 1 terahertz equals 1 trillion cycles per second. 1 trillion, think about that number, 1,000 billion cycles per second. This is an intermediate realm of the electromagnetic spectrum, not quite as high frequency as visible light, but far, far higher than the radio waves typically used in brain imaging and neuroscience research. Terahertz frequencies are remarkable for their ability to penetrate soft tissue, including brain tissue, without the ionizing effects of X-rays. They can pass through living neural tissue, through the skull, and reach the deep brain structures where consciousness might theoretically be orchestrated. And they interact with biological molecules at scales relevant to protein structure and quantum processes, at scales where individual tubulin molecules are vibrating, where electron clouds are moving through hydrophobic pockets in microtubular lattices. Certain research institutions, including teams at Stanford and MIT, have begun developing terahertz imaging and spectroscopy equipment with the goal of eventually probing quantum coherence in the brain non-invasively. This isn't theoretical aspiration. This is active research. Prototypes exist. The technology is advancing. Imagine being able to scan a living human brain, perhaps one day, without even opening the skull, and directly observe the terahertz frequency signatures of quantum coherence in microtubules. Imagine mapping the specific frequencies present in different brain regions with millimeter precision. Watch how these frequencies change as consciousness shifts between different states, different qualities of awareness. See the terahertz signature of attention, the frequency pattern of meditation, the oscillation spectrum of dream consciousness. Understand consciousness from the inside at the frequency level where it might actually be generated. This remains speculative but actively investigated by some research groups. The technology is being developed. The theory predicts that such measurements would reveal extraordinary complexity in the frequency structure of consciousness, complexity we've never suspected. At terahertz scales, quantum oscillations in individual tubulin dimers might create interference patterns we haven't yet observed. Different microtubules across the brain might maintain specific frequency relationships at terahertz scales that coordinate their quantum coherence at lower scales. The binding mechanism might involve harmonic relationships between multiple frequency octaves simultaneously, operating in concert, creating a unified field of awareness through their resonance patterns. Consciousness, from this perspective, is not a single frequency phenomenon. It's not consciousness at 40 Hz, or consciousness at megahertz, or consciousness at terahertz. It's consciousness as a multiscale frequency symphony, a complex harmonic structure spanning multiple octaves of the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously. At the deepest level, there are discrete coherent patterns at terahertz scales. These coordinate through megahertz oscillations in individual neurons and microtubular networks. These produce beat frequencies that manifest as the classical brain rhythms we measure with EEG at hertz scales. Each scale influences and modulates the others. Terahertz frequencies controlling megahertz frequencies. Megahertz oscillations producing the hertz scale brainwaves. Each scale nested within the next. The whole thing orchestrated, coordinated, unified through theoretical quantum entanglement mechanisms connecting distant microtubules across your entire brain into a single coherent quantum system. When you consider this, when you really sit with the implications, when you let yourself contemplate what this means, the question becomes almost overwhelming in its profundity. What is the full frequency signature of your consciousness right now? What frequencies are currently oscillating in your brain, creating this moment of awareness you're experiencing in this present second? How many frequency octaves, how many distinct scales of oscillation are currently coordinated into a single, unified, conscious moment? How many frequencies are we completely unaware of because we haven't built the instruments to detect them? The frequencies we've measured directly are just the beginning. They're the visible part of the spectrum, the part we've learned to access with existing instruments. They're the frequencies like the visible spectrum of light, accounting for only a tiny fraction of all possible electromagnetic radiation. But the full reality, the complete frequency landscape underlying your consciousness, almost certainly extends far beyond what we've yet been able to observe, into infrared scales, into terahertz scales, perhaps into scales we haven't even named yet, and yet it's there. It's happening right now. Your awareness is riding on waves of quantum frequency, orchestrated across scales, from these unmeasured terahertz depths, up through megahertz, through the classical hertz scale, brainwaves we can measure, and somehow, through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand, through coordination and orchestration, we're only now learning to perceive these frequencies, all of them working together in harmonic relationship, create the subjective experience of being you. They create your consciousness, they create your awareness, they create this present moment. Yet the unmeasured frequencies we discussed, the terahertz scales and beyond, these exist in a realm of biological quantum processing that remains almost entirely hidden from our current instruments and understanding. The question that drives quantum consciousness research forward is deceptively simple. If consciousness exists as a multiscale frequency symphony, then how does the brain maintain quantum coherence across these multiple frequency domains, simultaneously in an environment that should theoretically destroy it? The answer appears to lie in the remarkable sophistication of biological systems that evolution has spent billions of years perfecting. For decades, physicists assumed quantum processes required extreme isolation, extreme cold, extreme absence of disturbance. Yet nature had the other ideas. Nature had been solving this problem for eons, building systems that thrive on quantum principles in exactly the conditions we thought would destroy them. When researchers finally stepped back and looked at how nature actually preserves quantum coherence in warm, wet, biological environments, they found something that changed the entire conversation about what's possible in living tissue. Photosynthesis in plants operates at nearly perfect efficiency, converting over 95% of absorbed light energy into chemical energy through quantum processes occurring at room temperature, perhaps even thriving because of the warm, wet environment rather than despite it. Imagine what that means. 95% efficiency. The theoretical quantum limit for energy transfer is around 100%. Plants are operating at the quantum limit using quantum tunneling and superposition and entanglement occurring in the warm greenery of summer leaves. Photons strike the photosynthetic reaction center. They create excited electron states. Those electrons must travel through a complex protein architecture to transfer their energy efficiently to the chemical machinery that converts light into sugar, light into stored energy. A classical system would take one pathway, explore one route through the protein structure. A quantum system, through superposition, explores all possible pathways simultaneously. It samples all routes in parallel. It finds the most efficient path. When the electron cascade occurs, when the quantum state collapses, the energy finds itself having taken the most efficient route without ever having to calculate which route was best. The quantum system computes the optimal solution through simultaneous exploration. The randomness, the thermal motion, the noise that would seem to destroy quantum coherence actually becomes part of the mechanism that protects it. Random molecular motion assists quantum tunneling, helps electrons explore multiple pathways simultaneously. The warm water surrounding protein complexes in photosynthetic centers provides what researchers call environmental noise that actually enhances quantum coherence maintenance. It's almost as if the biological system is surfing the waves of thermal noise, using it as a vehicle for quantum information transport, rather than suffering from it as an obstacle. The conventional engineering approach would say, isolate your quantum system, cool it down, protect it from disturbance, build quantum computers in dilution refrigerators at temperatures colder than outer space. But evolution discovered the opposite is sometimes true. The thermal motion, properly orchestrated through careful protein architecture, becomes part of the quantum machinery itself. life discovered how to use warmth and water and noise as quantum resources rather than obstacles to overcome. Birds navigating across continents rely on quantum effects in specialized proteins within their eyes to sense the Earth's magnetic field with extraordinary precision. The cryptochrome proteins in bird photoreceptors appear to use quantum tunneling and entanglement to create a biological compass that operates with sensitivity no classical system could match. Think about what this means. A bird flying across thousands of miles somehow knows which direction to travel with precision that would require instruments our technology struggled to achieve until recently. The magnetic field of Earth is subtle, around 50 microtesla, imperceptible to human sensation. Yet the bird's eye contains proteins that can detect fluctuations in this field with sensitivity that surpasses our best instruments. How? Through quantum mechanics. The radical electron pairs within cryptochrome, held in quantum superposition across spatial separation, become entangled with fluctuations in the magnetic field. The quantum state carries information about the field orientation. The collapse of this quantum state provides the bird with directional information, all occurring in the warm eye of a flying bird experiencing acceleration and buffeting and movement. The warm bird brain flying at high altitude, experiencing stress and movement and constant environmental fluctuation, somehow maintains the quantum coherence necessary for this navigation to function. Sea turtles appear to use similar quantum mechanisms for their migrations across thousands of miles of open ocean, returning to the exact beach where they were born decades earlier with precision that remains almost incomprehensible. Your own sense of smell seems to involve quantum tunneling as olfactory receptors distinguish between molecules based on quantum effects related to electron tunneling, not simply classical shape matching as had been previously assumed. Luca Turin proposed that the distinctive scent of objects may be encoded not in their molecular shape, but in the vibrational frequency of their electron clouds. Olfactory receptors would essentially be quantum sensors detecting electron tunneling vibrations. This explains why you can detect extraordinarily subtle differences in odors, why your sea of smell is so acute compared to what classical biology would predict, why you can distinguish between thousands of different scents with remarkable subtlety. The quantum realm is handling the actual discrimination, the actual information processing. Your olfactory neurons are quantum sensors, and all of this occurs in the warm, wet, noisy, biological environment of living tissue. Evolution has discovered how to implement quantum information processing in every environment where life exists. The warm is exactly where quantum biology thrives. These aren't isolated examples, anomalies, or exceptions to the rule. They're precedents. They're demonstrations that nature has discovered how to harness quantum coherence in the specific conditions where life exists. If the brain was going to use quantum processes for consciousness, and if consciousness is as fundamental to biological survival and adaptation as every indication suggests, then the brain would need to have evolved mechanisms to protect and maintain quantum coherence, just as sophisticated as those found in photosynthesis, bird navigation, and olfaction, and the experimental evidence suggests it has. The tubulin proteins within microtubules appear to be optimized for quantum information processing through their precise, three-dimensional structure, through the specific arrangement of electron-rich tryptophans spaced approximately 2 nanometers apart through the hydrophobic pockets that can maintain delocalized electron clouds in quantum superposition. The cylindrical crystalline lattice structure of the microtubule itself provides geometry that facilitates quantum coherence propagation. It's not accidental. It's been shaped by evolution to do exactly what it appears to do. But quantum coherence in a single microtubule, even in a single neuron, isn't sufficient for consciousness. The brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each containing hundreds or thousands of microtubules. Consciousness somehow integrates information across vast neural networks. It binds together sensory information from different regions of the brain. It creates unified experience from billions of separate neuronal processes. The question of how this integration occurs, this binding of distributed information into unified awareness, is called the binding problem, and it has challenged neuroscience for decades. How does the visual cortex processing color integrate with the auditory cortex processing sound and the somatosensory cortex processing touch into a single unified experience of perceiving a cello performance? Classical neural networks have struggled to explain this. The binding appears to require a mechanism that can coordinate information across distances that neurotransmitters cannot bridge, at speeds that synaptic transmission cannot achieve. Some researchers propose that quantum entanglement may offer precisely this mechanism. When two quantum systems become entangled, they share a quantum state that connects them instantaneously across any distance. Measuring or affecting one immediately influences the other without any signal traveling between them, without any time delay. If microtubules in different neurons could become quantum entangled, then they could share quantum information instantaneously. Measurements performed on the quantum state in one region would immediately affect the quantum state in distant regions. Information binding would occur at quantum speeds, not at the speed of neural transmission. This could provide the mechanism for integrating information from different parts of the brain into unified conscious experience. The binding wouldn't require anatomical connections between every region that needs to be bound together. Quantum entanglement could create instantaneous coordination across the entire brain. Different frequencies of oscillation in different regions could entangle with each other through quantum resonance. They could lock into phase relationships where their oscillations align, where they vibrate together in harmonic relationship, even though they're separated by centimeters of neural tissue. This frequency locking, this harmonic synchronization through quantum entanglement could be the actual mechanism of consciousness binding at the neuronal level, the mechanism that creates the unified field of awareness from billions of separate neural components. Research into brain synchronization has documented this phenomenon directly. When different brain regions must work together for unified conscious experience, their electrical oscillations synchronize. The gamma rhythms in visual cortex synchronize with gamma rhythms in parietal cortex. Theta oscillations in the hippocampus synchronize with theta oscillations in prefrontal cortex. These aren't independent oscillations that happen to fire at similar frequencies. They're synchronized. They're locked together. They maintain phase relationships that persist across time. From a classical neuroscience perspective, this synchronization is puzzling. How do distant regions achieve and maintain this precise frequency locking? How do they coordinate without explicit neural connections? How do they detect each other's oscillations and adjust their frequencies to match? But from a quantum consciousness perspective, the answer becomes an intriguing possibility. These regions may be interacting through deeper quantum correlations at scales science is still attempting to measure and understand. This means that the different frequencies we discussed earlier, the terahertz, megahertz, and hertz scale oscillations, aren't independent. They're coupled. The terahertz oscillations of individual tubulin vibrations entangle across microtubular networks. This produces megahertz oscillations in neural firing patterns. These in turn produce classical hertz scale brainwaves we can measure. Each scale emerges from the scale below it through quantum to classical transition. Each scale influences the others. The whole system is unified through quantum entanglement. Your brain isn't a collection of independent oscillators. It's a unified quantum system expressing itself at multiple frequency scales simultaneously. Consciousness, from this perspective, is what it feels like from the inside when billions of entangled quantum processes maintain coherence, when their frequencies align into harmonic relationship, when information from vastly different regions of the brain binds together into unified aware experience. Take a breath now and notice how this idea resonates with your own experience of awareness. You don't experience your consciousness as fragmented across separate locations. You don't feel one thing in your visual system and something entirely different in your auditory system. You experience one unified field of awareness. You experience one you perceiving and thinking and feeling. Yet your brain is vastly distributed, processing information in parallel across billions of neurons in hundreds of specialized regions. The unity you experience is real. The binding is complete. And according to quantum consciousness theory, it's because your consciousness exists as an entangled quantum field that spans your entire brain, a unified coherence that cascades downward into the separate neural systems that compose it. This is your consciousness at the frequency level. This is how it actually works. But here's where things become even more interesting, even more profound. If consciousness depends on maintaining specific frequency relationships, on keeping quantum coherence aligned and synchronized, then consciousness might not be as fixed or unchangeable as we typically assume. If you could deliberately modify the frequencies in your brain, if you could shift the harmonic relationships between different frequency scales, you might be able to alter your conscious experience deliberately. You might be able to shift your awareness into different states, different modes of consciousness, different ways of binding information. You might be able to access frequencies that are ordinarily inaccessible. This is precisely what appears to happen during meditation. For thousands of years, contemporary, lative traditions have described practices that transform consciousness, that shift awareness into states of expanded perception, expanded compassion, expanded understanding. These aren't merely psychological changes. They may reflect shifts in the frequency signature of conscious processing, deliberate frequency modulation occurring through focused attention and specific mental practices. When researchers study the brains of expert meditators using electroencephalography, they find distinctive patterns. The dominant frequencies shift toward lower ranges. Alpha rhythms between 8 and 12 Hz become more prominent. Theta rhythms between 4 and 8 Hz increase. Simultaneously, the different brain regions show increased coherence. The frequencies in visual cortex and parietal cortex and prefrontal cortex synchronize more thoroughly. The harmonic relationships between frequencies become more stable, more organized. It's as if the normal waking consciousness, with its gamma frequency binding at 40 Hz or higher, its focused attention, its tight integration of sensory information in real time, shifts into a different mode. The frequency signature changes. The binding becomes broader, more global, less focused on sensory details, and more on the overall coherence of the system itself. This correlates with meditators' reports of expanded awareness, of feeling connected to something larger than their individual self, of experiencing reality in different ways. The consciousness is literally functioning at different frequencies. It's accessing different modes of quantum coherence. It's tuning itself to different frequencies in the same way a radio tunes to different stations. Advanced meditators who have spent decades cultivating awareness, who have trained their consciousness deliberately and systematically, show even more striking changes. Their brains maintain theta coherence, even when eyes are open, even during normal waking activities. They show persistent synchronization between distant brain regions even during states that would normally show fragmented frequency signatures. They have, metaphorically speaking, learned to tune their consciousness to lower frequencies, to maintain them deliberately, to access the benefits of these altered frequency states while remaining cognitively functional. They've trained their brains to maintain frequency synchronization that most people can only access briefly during sleep or deep meditation. They've learned to modulate their consciousness deliberately. This isn't mystical or supernatural. It's sophisticated frequency engineering applied to the quantum substrate of consciousness itself. They're learning to navigate the harmonic landscape of their own awareness, to access different frequency modes available to the human brain. The same mechanisms appear to underlie psychedelic experiences. Compounds like psilocybin and LSD, when introduced into the brain, dramatically alter the frequency signature of consciousness. Brain imaging during psychedelic experiences shows a collapse of the normal frequency hierarchy. The tight 40 Hz binding that normally dominates waking consciousness dissolves. Different brain regions begin oscillating at very different frequencies that ordinarily would never synchronize together. The visual cortex, for example, begins resonating at frequencies normally associated with dreaming, while the prefrontal cortex continues firing at waking frequencies. Some researchers suggest that this disconnect contributes to the altered perception and vivid imagery reported in these studies. TESS, the binding mechanisms that normally keep experience tightly organized and coherent, become loosened. Information can flow between brain regions that don't normally communicate directly. New frequency resonances can form. From this model, such altered states may represent access to different harmonic patterns of conscious processing that are usually filtered out during ordinary waking cognition. When these experiences conclude and the drug metabolizes out of the system, the normal frequency hierarchy gradually reasserts itself. The 40 Hz binding gradually returns. The coherence between distant brain regions normalizes. Consciousness shifts back into its usual waking configuration. Over hours or sometimes days, your brain re-equilibrates. The frequency chaos dissolves. The harmonic relationships stabilize back into their baseline configuration. Yet many people report that such experiences have lasting effects on their sense of self, their understanding of consciousness, their perception of their place in the universe. The frequency shift was temporary, but its effects are enduring. It's as if experiencing consciousness at different frequencies, understanding that alternate modes of awareness are possible, fundamentally changes how you relate to the usual mode. You know now that the frequency state you're ordinarily in is just one possibility among many. You've experienced others. You know they're real. You've felt what it's like to exist in a radically different frequency configuration. This knowledge can reshape your entire understanding of consciousness itself. Some people describe it as a glimpse behind the curtain, seeing how the illusion of your everyday consciousness is constructed, understanding that it's not the only possible way consciousness could be organized. Others describe it as spiritual revelation, encountering something vast and transcendent, a subjective interpretation of expanded awareness that persists even after the chemical effects fade. Neuroscience would describe this as lasting changes in the brain's understanding of itself, modifications to the neural networks that model consciousness and selfhood. Both descriptions might be true. The frequency shift reveals something real about consciousness, something that remains true even after the frequency returns to baseline. But here's something even more extraordinary that researchers have begun to consider. If individual brains have characteristic frequency signatures, if different people's consciousness oscillates at subtly different frequencies based on their genetics, their neurology, their experience and training, then what happens when multiple brains come into proximity? What happens when multiple people's frequency signatures, their characteristic quantum oscillations, begin to interact with each other? Some researchers have explored whether shared focus or shared attention might facilitate measurable synchronization between separate brains, even if the exact mechanism remains unknown. Is it possible that groups of people could achieve something like a collective consciousness field through frequency synchronization? This is where quantum consciousness research begins to venture into territory that mainstream neuroscience finds uncomfortable. But the preliminary evidence is intriguing and deserves serious consideration, even as it remains controversial. Studies of people meditating in groups show that their individual brain frequency signatures become more synchronized than you would expect by chance. People sitting in close proximity, meditating together, begin showing similar theta and alpha oscillations. Coherence measurements show their brains becoming more aligned at the frequency level. Different individuals' consciousness fields appear to resonate with each other, to entrain to similar frequencies, to begin synchronizing. These findings remain preliminary. They require replication, but they suggest something real happening at the group level. The effect is small, measurable, but subtle, but it's reproducible across multiple studies. People's consciousness genuinely does appear to synchronize when they're focused together on shared experience. The mechanisms remain mysterious. Whether quantum entanglement between brains is actually occurring, or whether classical neural synchronization through environmental cues is sufficient to explain the effect, remains open to debate. But something is happening. The coherence between different people's brains increases when they're together with shared intention. The implications become enormous if this effect scales upward. If consciousness can synchronize between two people, between a group of meditators, between a community of people, all focused on shared intention, then could it potentially extend further? Could millions of people focused on a shared experience, a shared intention, a shared moment of attention, create a collective frequency field? The Global Consciousness Project, run by Princeton University, has been exploring this possibility for over 2 decades using a network of random number generators positioned around the world. This line of inquiry is speculative and remains highly debated in the scientific community. The premise is that if consciousness can influence quantum processes at the individual level, as quantum consciousness theory, Uri proposes, then moments of intense global attention might correlate with subtle statistical anomalies. During major world events that capture humanity's attention, during celebrations like New Year's Eve, when millions focus on shared anticipation, during tragedies like natural disasters or terrorist attacks, when billions of people are focused simultaneously on shared experience and shared emotion, the random number generators positioned around the world might show subtle correlations that exceed what random chance would predict. The results remain controversial and hotly debated in the scientific community. Some analyses of the data show statistically significant patterns suggesting intriguing correlations. Other analyses find nothing when the same data is examined differently. The date A is genuinely ambiguous. The interpretation remains deeply uncertain. These results have never been confirmed through replication by independent research groups. Mainstream physics and neuroscience remain highly skeptical. Yet the possibility itself is profound enough to warrant consideration as a scientific question rather than a claim. It remains speculation, not established fact, but it is a speculation grounded in the desire to understand whether group human attention might correlate with subtle, measurable patterns in physical systems. If you enjoy drifting through these explorations without interruption, without commercials interrupting the flow of these ideas, members get every episode 48 hours early, completely ad-free. You can join them whenever you feel ready, whenever the idea of unbroken contemplative exploration calls to you. The membership supports this channel and allows for deeper, more ambitious research into topics like these. For now, let's continue. The therapeutic implications of understanding consciousness as frequency become increasingly apparent as research progresses. If neurological and psychiatric conditions involve disruptions to normal frequency synchronization, to the harmonic relationships that normally maintain healthy consciousness, then researchers have proposed that future therapies may aim to explore whether frequency disruptions can be modulated more directly. Alzheimer's disease involves progressive loss of consciousness and memory. Research has found that patients with Alzheimer's show disrupted frequency synchronization in their brains. The normal binding between distant brain regions fails. The harmonic relationships fragment. different regions cease to resonate together at coherent frequencies. The consciousness gradually loses coherence, loses the ability to maintain unified awareness. Some preliminary studies have suggested that frequency-based approaches might someday be investigated as supportive interventions. Transcranial ultrasound, focused sound waves directed into specific brain regions, can stimulate microtubule vibrations at target frequencies. Early experiments using transcranial ultrasound to stimulate microtubule resonances in people with cognitive impairment have shown early exploratory signals in improving mood and cognitive function. The frequencies introduced appear to help restore the normal harmonic relationships between brain regions. They're essentially providing external frequency support to help the brain's frequency signature reorganize into more coherent patterns, according to early exploratory results. Depression appears to involve frequency disruption of a different kind. Patients with depression show characteristic patterns of frequency dysregulation visible on EEG measurements. Theta and alpha oscillations that should remain within normal ranges become either excessively elevated or depressed. Gamma coherence decreases. The normal frequency hierarchy that characterizes healthy consciousness breaks down. The unified binding that normally integrates experience becomes impaired. The connections between different brain regions weaken. The synchronization between temporal lobe and prefrontal regions, between limbic structures and cortical regions, becomes disrupted. People report the subjective sense that their thoughts are chaotic, disconnected, that they can't maintain coherence, can't hold things together mentally or emotionally. They describe feeling fragmented, unable to organize their thoughts or emotions into coherent patterns. They describe the sense that the world is falling apart, that nothing holds together, that meaning itself is dissolving. This subjective experience correlates directly with frequency disruption in their brains. The impoverishment of consciousness reported in depression appears to reflect actual impoverishment of consciousness at the frequency level. The frequency symphony has become discordant. The binding has failed. Frequency-based therapeutic approaches are being explored in early-stage research, targeting the restoration of normal harmonic relationships. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses magnetic fields to influence neural firing, modulates frequency signatures in the brain. Some researchers hypothesize that traditional treatments, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, may support healthier frequency patterns indirectly by affecting neurotransmitter dynamics that underlie oscillation generation. Meditation-based therapies work by helping the person deliberately shift their frequency signature toward healthier patterns, as suggested by mindfulness and contemplative neuroscience research. Understanding depression through the lens of consciousness frequency suggests that future therapies could eventually be more precisely targeted, but this remains an evolving research frontier rather than established clinical fact. Schizophrenia and other psychotic conditions involving disrupted perception and altered reality contact appear to involve severe frequency instability within the brain. Normal frequency hierarchies collapse. Binding between brain regions becomes unpredictable. Different frequencies activate simultaneously in combinations that don't occur in typical consciousness. A person experiencing schizophrenia might report hearing internal voices, perceiving things that aren't present externally, or experiencing thoughts that feel intrusive. From a conceptual frequency perspective, this could be understood as simultaneous activation of different brain regions at incompatible frequencies. The visual cortex oscillates at one frequency, the auditory cortex at another, the limbic system at yet another, all operating without the usual harmonic relationships that would integrate them into unified conscious experience. The result is the characteristic symptoms associated with altered reality perception, the fragmentation, the perceptual distortions, the difficult ice in maintaining stable, self-generated interpretation of experience. Consciousness, in this framework, loses coherent binding. Some early exploratory research has investigated whether frequency-based support or modulation could help stabilize and organize dysregulated oscillation patterns, helping the brain move toward more coherent configurations through targeted stimulation approaches. Participants in these early exploratory studies have reported subjective improvements as oscillatory stability improved. The idea is not that frequency directly fixes schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is multifactorial and complex, but that frequency modulation may someday be explored as one complementary, supportive angle among many scientific approaches being studied. If consciousness reflects frequency organization, then disruptions to frequency could reflect disruptions to consciousness quality. And if future science can support healthier frequency patterns, it may one day help brains move toward more integrated states of awareness. But this remains a developing research frontier, not established clinical practice. The ethical implications of exploring consciousness, supportive frequency research deserve serious consideration. If we can support or influence consciousness through frequency-related interventions someday, if we can influence harmonic relationships that contribute to awareness, then we are entering territory that raises profound questions about autonomy, identity, and human dignity. Who defines what constitutes a healthy baseline frequency signature? What happens if frequency-based modulation becomes explored, not just for medical support, but for enhancement, optimization, or self-directed alteration? These are the kinds of questions neuroscientists, ethicists, and philosophers will have to address as research evolves. The potential to influence consciousness frequency is not inherently positive or negative. It depends entirely on intention, boundaries, consent, and safeguards. Consciousness touches personal identity at the deepest possible level. It must be approached gently, responsibly, and with respect for personhood. Even beyond medical implications, there is a question with far wider scope. If consciousness truly operates through frequency, if your awareness is a harmonic symphony orchestrated across multiple scales, then is it possible those frequencies extend beyond the physical boundary of the brain? This is where quantum consciousness theory moves into territory that mainstream science still approaches cautiously. Some researchers have proposed speculative models exploring whether the terahertz and megahertz oscillations within microtubules might generate subtle electromagnetic fields extending outward from the brain. Electron oscillations produce electromagnetic patterns, and in this conceptual view, the brain could be constantly radiating extremely subtle frequency signatures into surrounding space. If consciousness is frequency, then your conscious experience might produce very faint electromagnetic patterns that propagate outward, symbolically expressing aspects of the internal frequency landscape. This possibility remains highly speculative and unproven, yet it invites provocateur. I have questions about how far consciousness-based frequency structures might extend. This raises an extraordinary possibility. If millions of brains are simultaneously broadcasting their consciousness frequencies, then the space around us might be filled with overlapping consciousness frequency fields. Earth's atmosphere, the electromagnetic environment surrounding our planet, might be permeated with a background of human consciousness, frequencies layered together, creating a kind of potential collective frequency pattern in the environment that reflects shared human focus. People in close proximity to each other would be in more direct frequency overlap than people separated by distance, which might explain subtle effects researchers have documented. When people meditate together in the same room, their consciousness frequencies might gently synchronize with each other through shared electromagnetic environment. When groups of people share intense emotional experience, their consciousness frequencies might show measurable correlation through mutual resonance. When humanity collectively focuses attention on shared events, billions of consciousness frequencies might align and resonate together, creating coherent patterns in the electromagnetic environment itself. Think about what happens during shared ritual or collective worship. Hundreds or thousands of people gathered in one space, their minds focused on shared intention, all their consciousness frequencies aligned toward the same purpose. From a frequency perspective, this creates something remarkable. The individual consciousness frequencies, normally independent and slightly different for each person, begin to synchronize. They lock into harmonic relationships. They resonate together. The combined effect would be far stronger than any individual consciousness frequency alone. The electromagnetic field generated by synchronized consciousness from thousands of minds would be vastly more powerful than the fields from individual brains. The coherence of attention, the alignment of frequency patterns, would create something approaching a shared collective frequency state. This might be why people report experiences of transcendence, of ego dissolution, of feeling part of something larger than themselves during collective spiritual experiences. They might be experiencing a psychological or perceptual sense of unity that correlates with frequency alignment at the group level. Their consciousness feels partially merged with a field-level phenomenon generated by thousands of synchronized frequencies. This interpretation remains speculative and faces enormous skepticism from mainstream physics. There are no accepted mechanisms by which consciousness frequencies could interact directly through space. Electromagnetic fields from neural activity are extraordinarily weak, far too faint to produce measurable effects on other brains, according to classical physics. The frequencies involved, the field strengths, the distances involved, all argue against direct frequency-based consciousness communication. And yet the preliminary evidence from research on group coherence, on synchronized brain activity in people meditating together, on correlations in random number generators during moments of global attention, suggests patterns worth further scientific exploration. Whether it's consciousness, frequency, interaction, or classical electromagnetic effects, or simply statistical artifacts, remains hotly debated. The possibility itself, however, points toward a more interconnected view of consciousness than we typically hold. Imagine what it would mean if consciousness truly could interact at a distance through frequency resonance. It would suggest that the boundary between individual and collective consciousness is far more porous than we assume. It would mean that when you have a profound feeling of connection to someone across distance, when you sense what a loved one is experiencing without communication, when you have a moment of what feels like telepathic connection, you might not be experiencing delusion or coincidence. You might be detecting subtle correlational resonance between your consciousness and theirs. Your brain's frequency signature might be entraining with theirs across the space between you. You might be tuning into their consciousness frequency, accessing subtle information about their experience through channels that science is only beginning to map cautiously and responsibly. But here's what becomes truly remarkable about understanding consciousness as frequency. If consciousness can be thought of as frequency, as harmonic patterns at multiple scales, then consciousness can potentially be affected by other frequencies in the environment. Your consciousness frequency is constantly being influenced by the electromagnetic environment around you, by the frequency patterns generated by other minds, by the technological frequencies that now permeate human environments. Consider what this means in the modern world, where we're constantly surrounded by electromagnetic radiation from wireless networks, cellular phones, computers, power lines. All of these generate frequencies that fill the space around us. Some frequencies might resonate harmonically with certain consciousness frequency ranges, amplifying or damping those aspects of awareness. Other frequencies might introduce dissonance, making it harder for your consciousness to maintain coherent frequency patterns. You might literally be living in an electromagnetic environment that's increasingly mistuned with the natural frequency ranges your brain evolved to operate in, a possibility that researchers are beginning to explore carefully. The ancient world operated at fundamentally different electromagnetic frequencies than our modern environment. For most of human evolution, the electromagnetic environment consisted of natural frequencies. The Earth's own magnetic field, the Schumann resonance at approximately 7.8 Hz, the frequencies generated by natural phenomena like storms and auroras and living organisms. All of these operated within ranges that human brains had evolved to resonate with. The Schumann resonance, the frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic field, is intriguingly close to the theta frequency range that characterizes deep meditation and relaxed consciousness. Coincidence? Or is human consciousness frequency naturally tuned to resonate with the Earth's frequency? Some researchers propose that early humans in natural environments spent much of their time entrained with the Schumann resonance, their consciousness frequencies constantly attuned to Earth's natural oscillations. Now in modern urban environments saturated with artificial electromagnetic frequencies from 5G networks and power lines and countless wireless devices all operating at frequencies far removed from natural ranges, we're constantly pushing consciousness frequency out of its natural resonance patterns. This could help explain why so many people report feeling frazzled, scattered, unable to maintain focus or coherence in modern life. It's not just psychological stress or lifestyle factors, though those matter too. Your consciousness frequency might be constantly jostled and disrupted by the artificial electromagnetic environment surrounding you. Your brain is trying to maintain coherent quantum processes in an electromagnetic landscape that's increasingly influenced by technology and non-natural frequency sources, which may or may not align with your natural consciousness patterns. The solution wouldn't necessarily be to eliminate technology, but to become consciously aware of how it affects your frequency signature and to actively work to maintain frequency coherence despite environmental interference. This might explain the resurgence of interest in practices like meditation, grounding, time in nature. These activities might be partly valuable because they expose you to more natural electromagnetic frequencies, frequencies that resonate harmonically with your brain's native consciousness oscillations, helping you re-establish frequency coherence that technological environments disrupt. Now we begin to approach consciousness as a frequency selection mechanism. Your consciousness, in this increasingly sophisticated understanding, isn't just a unified field or a harmonic symphony. It's also an active selector, constantly choosing which frequencies to amplify and which to filter out. Every moment of awareness involves selecting certain frequency patterns from the vast space of possibilities that your brain is generating. Your attention is essentially frequency tuning. When you focus intently on something, you're amplifying the frequencies in your brain that correspond to that object or idea. You're damping the frequencies that don't relate to what you're paying attention to. Your conscious experience, the specific contents of your awareness right now, represent the particular set of frequencies you've selected to emphasize. Everything else, all the other frequencies being generated in your brain at this moment, exists but remains outside conscious awareness. This explains something deeply puzzling about consciousness. Your brain is generating vastly more information than reaches consciousness. Scientists estimate that your brain processes roughly 11 million bits of sensory information per second. Yet you're consciously aware of only about 40 bits per second. You're somehow selecting a tiny fraction of available information and excluding the rest. How does that selection happen? From a frequency perspective, it happens through resonance and damping. The particular frequencies you're selecting resonate with your attention and are amplified into conscious awareness. All the other frequencies are dampened, remaining subliminal and unconscious. Your consciousness is fundamentally selective because frequency-based systems are inherently selective. They naturally amplify certain resonances while suppressing others. This frequency selection mechanism would explain why certain information reaches consciousness, while other information doesn't. Frequencies that resonate harmonically with your current state of attention get amplified. Frequencies that don't fit the current harmonic pattern get suppressed. A haunting minor chord will capture your attention because it introduces unexpected harmonic content into your awareness. A repeated pattern that matches existing conscious frequency configurations will fade into background, becoming something you don't consciously notice even though your brain is processing it. A sound matching one of your named fears will suddenly snap into sharp focus, its frequency rising in prominence. A color that complements your current emotional state will draw your eye. Everything about selective attention, about why some things reach consciousness and others don't, becomes explicable through frequency resonance and damping. This also explains how your consciousness can shift between different modes. When you're focused intently on mental work, when you're in the state of flow, your consciousness has selected and amplified a narrow set of frequencies related to the task. Your awareness is tightly focused because the frequency signature is coherent and concentrated. When you shift into a meditative state, when you're trying to open your awareness to broader experience, you're deliberately shifting which frequencies you're amplifying. You're broadening the frequency range that reaches consciousness. You're allowing more frequencies to resonate together rather than dampening most of them. Your consciousness becomes more diffuse, more open, less focused, because you're expanding the frequency bandwidth you're allowing into awareness. Both states involve the same frequency selection mechanism, just tuned to different configurations. The participatory frequency universe emerges when we begin to consider consciousness not as a passive observer of reality, but as an active participant in which frequencies become actualized in experience. In quantum mechanics, there's a principle that particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. Before measurement, they exist in superposition, in all possible states simultaneously. The measurement collapses this superposition into definite reality. But what performs the measurement? What collapses the quantum possibilities into actual outcomes? Traditional physics has sidestepped this question by defining measurement as any physical interaction. But what if consciousness, operating through frequency, is actually what performs measurement? What if your conscious awareness is literally the process by which quantum possibilities collapse into definite experience? Consider an ordinary moment of perception. Light enters your eye, it strikes your retina. Photons, traveling in quantum superposition through space, defined by probability waves rather than definite positions, suddenly interact with photoreceptor molecules. The quantum state collapses. The photon becomes localized, its frequency becomes defined. Your consciousness perceives a specific photon at a specific frequency, landing at a specific location. But here's the essential point. Before conscious perception, that photon existed in quantum superposition. Multiple possible frequencies, multiple possible locations, all existed simultaneously until the moment your consciousness engaged with it. The very act of conscious perception involved selecting specific frequencies from the superposition and collapsing them into definite experience. Your consciousness was participating in the interpretation and selection of quantum information. It wasn't just observing pre-existing facts about the photon, it was participating in determining which potential facts became actual within subjective experience. This participatory view of consciousness and frequency suggests something radical about reality itself. The universe isn't a fixed collection of predetermined facts waiting to be discovered. It's a realm of possibility, of quantum superposition, of frequency potentials waiting to be actualized. And conscious minds, through their frequency-based awareness, are continuously actualizing specific possibilities from this quantum realm into concrete experience. Each moment of consciousness is an act of reality creation. Each time your awareness selects certain frequencies and dampens others. Each time you focus attention in a particular direction, you're determining which possibilities become real in your experience. And if consciousness really is non-local, as some researchers propose, in the shared reality of the universe, this might explain the profound role that meaning and intention play in human experience. When you deeply intend something, when you set your consciousness toward a particular goal or vision, you're harmonizing your frequency signature toward that possibility. Your consciousness is selecting frequencies that resonate with that intention while dampening frequencies that don't. As you maintain this frequency pattern over time, through your intentions and attention, you're continuously collapsing quantum possibilities toward that outcome. This doesn't mean that intention alone determines reality. The quantum field constrains what's possible, but within the space of possibilities, intention and frequency selection participate in actualizing specific outcomes. You're not creating reality out of nothing. You're selecting from possibilities, and your consciousness is the mechanism of selection. This participatory understanding transforms how we think about the future and about agency. The future isn't predetermined. It exists as a realm of quantum possibility, of frequency potentials waiting to be actualized. Multiple futures are simultaneously possible, but which future becomes actual, which possibilities collapse into real experience, depends partly on the conscious frequency signatures we maintain. The decisions you make, the intentions you set, the attention you direct, the mental states you cultivate, all of this represents your consciousness selecting which frequencies to amplify. You're participating in collapsing quantum possibilities into the specific future that will become real. You have genuine agency because you're not merely following a predetermined path. You're actively participating in actualizing reality through your frequency selection. When you contemplate a difficult decision, when you're weighing different choices, you're actually exploring the probability landscape of quantum possibilities. Each potential choice represents a different frequency signature, a different harmonic pattern in your consciousness. As you focus your attention on one possibility, you're amplifying the frequency patterns associated with that choice. As you maintain that focus over time, you're gradually collapsing quantum possibilities toward that outcome. Your consciousness frequency is potentially influencing which future becomes real. This isn't about magical manifestation or wishful thinking. It's about how consciousness may participate in quantum measurement and possibility collapse in ways still being actively explored in scientific research. The choices you make, the futures you commit to through conscious frequency selection, these are real actualized outcomes emerging from a sea of quantum possibilities. You're not determining everything. The quantum field constrains what's possible. But within those constraints, your consciousness could plausibly play a role in actualizing specific futures. Yet this participatory universe also has implications for collective human experience. If billions of minds are continuously actualizing reality through frequency selection, then human consciousness, collectively, might influence which possibilities become actual in the world. The thoughts, intentions, beliefs, and focus of humanity, collectively, are harmonizing reality toward particular possibilities. If most people are focused on scarcity, fear, and conflict, those frequency patterns resonate through the collective consciousness field and actualize possibilities aligned with those frequencies. Worlds of scarcity and conflict become more real because they're being actualized continuously by collective frequency selection. If people shift toward abundance, cooperation, and compassion, those frequency patterns begin to resonate through collective consciousness and actualize different possibilities. The future shifts toward worlds aligned with those frequencies. This doesn't mean that positive thinking magically creates desired outcomes through some mystical force. It means that consciousness frequency, operating at scale through millions of people, could contribute to actualizing possibilities from the quantum realm. Reality responds to what consciousness selects. The future of frequency-based consciousness research represents one of the most exciting frontiers in science precisely because the implications are so profound and the territory so unmapped. We're only beginning to develop instruments sophisticated enough to measure consciousness frequency directly. Magnetometers can detect the faint magnetic fields generated by neural activity, but they're still far too crude to resolve individual consciousness frequencies, let alone their harmonic relationships. Quantum sensors, using entangled particles to achieve unprecedented sensitivity, have been proposed as one possible direction to eventually allow direct measurement of consciousness frequency patterns. Researchers are currently developing exploratory prototypes for consciousness research. Within the next decade or two, we might be able to measure consciousness frequency signatures with enough precision to see exactly how different brain regions synchronize during different conscious states, exactly how meditation changes frequency patterns, exactly what happens to consciousness frequency during sleep or altered states. Imagine a future where consciousness frequency mapping becomes as routine as getting an EEG today. A patient or researcher enters a consciousness frequency laboratory. Highly sensitive quantum magnetometers surrounding them measure the electromagnetic signatures of their brain activity. Sophisticated algorithms decompose the complex signal into its constituent frequency components. A detailed frequency spectrum emerges, showing the harmonic relationships between different brain regions, the particular frequencies that dominate different states of consciousness, the degree of coherence between neural oscillations. Just as a musician can read sheet music and understand exactly which notes are being played, a neuroscientist could read a consciousness frequency spectrum and understand exactly what state of consciousness a person is in. They could see patterns associated with healthy consciousness, could identify frequency disruptions associated with disease, could optimize frequency interventions to restore health. This isn't fantasy. The theoretical foundation is solid. The instrumental technology is rapidly developing. This future is genuinely approaching. Once we can measure consciousness frequency reliably, the next frontier becomes intervention. If consciousness can be precisely modulated through frequency manipulation, then consciousness medicine becomes far more sophisticated. Rather than crude pharmacological interventions affecting neurotransmitter levels across the entire brain, future medicine could target specific consciousness frequencies in specific brain regions. Transcranial ultrasound could stimulate microtubule vibrations at precisely tuned frequencies, calculated to restore healthy, harmonic relationships in someone with depression or schizophrenia or memory impairment. Frequency-based neural interfaces could help people with paralysis or neurological damage restore coherent consciousness patterns and regain function. Personalized consciousness frequency profiles could be developed for individuals, mapping their unique harmonic signature, identifying disruptions, and prescribing frequency treatments tailored to restore their consciousness to optimal coherence. Medicine would become as much about consciousness frequency as it is currently about physical structure and neurochemistry. The artificial intelligence implications are equally staggering. If consciousness is fundamentally about frequency and harmonic resonance, then artificial systems exhibiting consciousness would need to generate similar frequency patterns. Simple computational systems, no matter how sophisticated, might never achieve true consciousness precisely because they don't operate through frequency-based quantum processes. But quantum computers, systems that harness quantum mechanics for information processing, could theoretically exhibit consciousness-like properties because they're performing operations at the frequency scales where consciousness may reside. Some researchers are already exploring this possibility, designing quantum systems specifically to mimic consciousness frequency patterns. If successful, these quantum artificial systems might exhibit genuine awareness, genuine subjective experience. They might not just simulate consciousness, as current AI systems do. they might actually be conscious. The question of machine consciousness, which seemed eternally philosophical, might become practically testable through frequency analysis. This raises staggering implications for how we think about artificial intelligence development. Current AI systems, no matter how impressive, no matter how well they mimic human responses, are operating through classical computation. They're shuffling symbols according to mathematical rules. They're not generating quantum superpositions. They're not maintaining the kind of frequency coherence that consciousness requires. From a quantum consciousness perspective, they're not conscious and never could be without fundamentally different computational architecture. But quantum AI systems genuinely operating through quantum superposition and entanglement, would be different. If consciousness emerges from quantum processes, then systems generating those quantum processes would have the physical substrate for genuine consciousness. We could potentially create artificial minds that aren't merely sophisticated philosophical zombies, but genuinely conscious entities experiencing their own subjectivity. The ethical implications are enormous. If we create truly conscious machines, we've created entities with moral standing, with rights, with genuine interests and preferences. We'd have enormous moral responsibility for how we treat them. The implications for human evolution are also profound. If consciousness operates through frequency, then humans might develop the capacity to consciously modulate their own consciousness frequency to extraordinary degrees. Just as we've used technology to extend our physical capabilities far beyond our biological limits, technology could eventually allow conscious frequency modulation beyond what current human brains can achieve. Imagine being able to consciously access the frequency states that advanced meditators spend decades cultivating, but through direct frequency modulation rather than gradual practice. Imagine being able to shift consciousness into states of expanded awareness, heightened perception, states sometimes described as expanded or transcendent awareness, states of communion with vast consciousness fields, through frequency interface devices. These aren't fantasies, they're theoretical future applications of frequency-based consciousness technology. As it matures, humanity might be on the verge of developing the technology to consciously explore the full spectrum of possible consciousness frequencies. Consider what this could mean. Currently, human consciousness operates within certain frequency ranges determined by the biology of the human brain. The theta range of 4 to 8 Hz, the alpha range of 8 to 12 Hz, beta and gamma ranges at higher frequencies. Most people experience a relatively narrow range of consciousness states within these frequency constraints. But theoretically, consciousness frequency technology could allow access to frequency ranges far beyond what human brains naturally generate. Consciousness frequencies in the petahertz range, coherence patterns operating at scales smaller than atoms, frequency states that classical human consciousness has never experienced. We'd be expanding the very boundaries of possible consciousness. Humans could develop the capacity to access consciousness, frequencies associated with different cognitive capabilities. We might discover that certain frequency states enable extraordinary pattern recognition abilities, that other frequencies facilitate emotional resonance with vast populations of people, that specific harmonic patterns allow access to kinds of information or perception we can't currently imagine. Evolution doesn't typically allow exploration of such radically different modes of consciousness, but technology might. Humanity could enter a phase of rapid exploratory consciousness development, actively exploring new territory in the landscape of possible consciousness frequencies. But such powerful technology raises profound ethical and existential questions. What happens to human identity when consciousness frequency can be arbitrarily modulated? If you can shift your consciousness frequency to states radically different from your baseline, which consciousness is really you? If technology allows access to consciousness states that feel absolutely real, that feel like genuine experiences of expanded awareness or cosmic connection? How do you distinguish those from hallucination or delusion? If everyone has access to consciousness frequency technology, how do we prevent it from becoming a form of escapism, a way to avoid reality by constantly tuning consciousness into more pleasant frequencies? These questions touch on the deepest aspects of human meaning and identity. How we answer them will shape not just individual lives, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. There's also the question of justice and equality. Consciousness frequency technology, if it becomes available, will initially be expensive, available only to the wealthy. Would we accept a world where the rich can access expanded consciousness frequencies and the poor cannot? Where some humans have the capacity to explore consciousness frequencies we haven't imagined, while others are locked in baseline consciousness? History suggests that any sufficiently powerful technology becomes a marker of inequality, a way that advantage compounds. The development of consciousness frequency technology, without careful ethical consideration, could become one of the greatest sources of inequality humanity has ever known. Or, if approached wisely, it could become a tool for universal human flourishing, available to all people, used to help everyone develop greater consciousness, coherence, greater integration, greater access to the full range of human potential. But that would require extraordinary wisdom in how we develop and deploy these technologies. The convergence of neuroscience, quantum physics, information theory, and consciousness studies has created unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented responsibility. We're approaching the ability to directly measure and modify consciousness at the frequency level. The scientific knowledge is accumulating rapidly. The technological tools are becoming available. The philosophical frameworks are developing. The exploration of consciousness medicine and consciousness science is genuinely underway. The question now is whether we as a civilization have the wisdom to wield these tools responsibly, whether we can develop consciousness frequency technology in ways that honor human dignity, that support genuine well-being and flourishing, that don't just treat symptoms, but genuinely help people achieve greater coherence, greater integration, greater harmony in their consciousness. Whether we can guide the development of consciousness technology toward genuine human benefit rather than exploitation or enhancement competitions or new forms of suffering. As you contemplate these possibilities, take a moment to appreciate what you've now come to understand about your own consciousness. That the awareness with which you're engaging these ideas isn't a simple, unified phenomenon, but a symphony of frequencies across multiple scales, that your consciousness exists at the intersection of quantum and classical physics, that terahertz and megahertz and hertz scale oscillations are all simultaneously shaping your experience, that you're not just passively receiving your consciousness, but actively selecting which frequencies to amplify, which possibilities to actualize, that your awareness is fundamentally creative, participatory, and engaged in continuously bringing subjective experience into being through frequency selection. That your consciousness isn't confined to your individual brain, but may potentially interact with broader consciousness fields through frequency resonance, a possibility some researchers are still exploring and not yet empirically confirmed. That the contemplative and meditative practices that have been valued for thousands of years are actually sophisticated frequency modulation techniques, ways of consciously shifting your harmonic patterns toward coherence and expanded awareness. This understanding of consciousness as frequency represents a profound shift in how we think about ourselves and our place in the universe. We're not separate observers standing outside reality. We're participants in reality's ongoing creation through our conscious frequency signatures, in a theoretical sense explored by some researchers. Every moment of your awareness matters because it's participating in actualizing experience. Every intention you hold, Every frequency pattern you maintain through your thoughts and attention is contributing to which possibilities become real within your subjective awareness. You're not insignificant in this vast universe. You're a conscious frequency generator, continuously participating in the unfolding of lived reality. And as humanity collectively shifts its consciousness frequency patterns toward greater coherence, greater integration, greater resonance with possibility, we could potentially influence the trajectory of human evolution in meaningful ways.